Hello and welcome, everyone. Today, I am joined by some very special guests. This is a continuation of the series begun on Voices with Vervaeke, the artful scaling of the religion that's not a religion. And so I am joined by John Vervaeke and Layman Pascal, and we're going to kind of pick up from where we left off. Hopefully, folks will be familiar with what we've already kind of done over there. But for those who need a quick refresh, we'll do a little intro and a little recap and then dive back into the conversation. So, John, if you want to go first and give a little intro and recap.
Thank you, Brendan. I'm John Vervaeke. I'm the author of the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis series and several other series, Untangling the World Knot with Greg Enriquez, The Elusive Eye with Greg and with Christopher Mastapietro, and then with Zach Stein and Greg towards a metapsychology that is true to transformation. And I'm also, sounds like it's a side job. My main job is actually, I'm a professor at the University of Toronto in cognitive psychology and cognitive science. So I guess I'm also the person who has at least labeled it, although I think many other people are pursuing this project of the religion that's not a religion. I've labeled it, and then Paul Vanderklay and Jonathan Piaget have leveled fair criticism about the scaling problem. And then Brendan and Layman reached out to me, let's talk about the artful scaling of the religion that's not a religion. Last time, just to give the highlights that stand out in my mind, we zeroed in on some problems. We zeroed in on problems of pedagogical pluralism. We're teaching many different people at many different backgrounds. With the problem of the con versus the conveyor belt. How are we conveying people in without conning them, and how do we prevent the conveyor belt from becoming an excuse for conning and manipulating people? We're dealing with competing ontologies. This is the Heideggerian notion of technologies that embed and insinuate an ontology into our minds and our characters in ways that we often are blind to. And then the last one was the code problem. How do we present materials so it reaches people within a certain cultural cognitive grammar while also challenging that? And it was a sweet spot there. And then it seemed to me, and Brendan and Layman seemed to agree, that when we were trying to address these issues, we were, at least in part, trying to explicate trustworthiness. One proposal we discussed was the idea of an ecology of institutions that act as dynamical constraints on each other, something analogous to the church and the monastery and the university, and that could help. And so that checks and balance and self-correcting dynamical system. So making a system as self-correcting as possible was one mark. But then I raised the question explicitly about what are the marks of trustworthiness that we should be looking for, both in individuals and institutions. So that's sort of my gist of what I saw happening last time.
Great. Yeah, thanks. I think that's really helpful. Layman, what's your take?
Well, it's an honor and pleasure to be again in the company of two such explorers, and also in the company of whatever spirit can move between, spill over, and inspire us to subtler and more radiant things. I'm a thinker and communicator specializing in spirituality of a certain kind, and I guess, just judging by my clothes, where this top button looks suspiciously like a Jesuit outfit, I'm a priest who isn't a priest, which might be perfect for the religion that isn't a religion. I think we began a discussion last time with the art, meaning both the skill and the valorization of aesthetics involved in tailoring behavioral and conceptual communication of wisdom practices and wisdom principles to different temperamental and hermeneutic demographics, as well as cultivating ways of doing that at larger scales over intergenerational periods of time. I sort of think about, like, what are the regional biomes in the ecology of practices, and how can an ecology of institutions secure and verify and amplify rather than substitute, undermine, and exploit the cultivation of wisdom in beings like us.
Awesome.
And I think last time that conversation evolved into a consideration at the end of trust and plausibility and seriousness.
Yeah.
How do we take seriously a person or a practice or an institution that purports to provide wisdom instruction? How do we evaluate ourselves to see if something trustworthy is emerging in us? And what kinds of symbols and phrasings and situations produce that adequately visceral nod of participatory willingness, as well as when and how we should be concerned to tease apart all of that from the hypnotic hacking of our minds by groups, individuals, markets, and machines. So that's where I think we're at. I'm very interested in talking about trust as mutual adaptation, trust as a synonym for value generally, the differences between trust as something that you can get from people by phrasing things a certain way, and trust as something you can elicit from people by embracing where they're already at. And part of that, coming back to Brendan, will be, is narratives used more as a cause or a side effect of workable processes in this regard?
Great. Well, yeah. All right. So that's sort of, I can't really add anything better to that. I think that pretty much tracks pretty well with where I'm at with all this. And what I'd love to do at the outset here is, as a way into kind of exploring the trustworthiness issue. I think for me, this is so caught up with the pedagogical issue that I'd like to dig in a little bit more and throw some more specific framing of that idea into the mix here, in order to kind of clarify where I'm sort of coming at the trustworthiness question and really all of these issues more broadly. And I'd love to see if this framing of it lands, if there are ways in which it's also problematic in ways that we might want to consider. And so for me, this gets to the way of clarifying what Layman called the functional subdivisions that we're really addressing in this sort of different demographic populations question. And so, as John also rightly noted, that it's a concern to try to engage in certain taxonomies of groups of people, as he said himself. And you're either going to do it scientifically or not at all. And so one of the ways that I found most helpful for being able to do this is through developmental psychology. And I think a great way of sort of framing this would be like through the work of James Fowler. This is the Stages of Faith work, which has been highly influential, very frequently cited. It's the basis of a great deal amount of work, and I feel like it at least offers an initial kind of way into these considerations, because it offers what I view to be a helpful maybe taxonomy we can use loosely, but still as a helpful guide with these different stages of faith. And we don't have to get into what they are specifically, but what it does that I find to be useful is it frames the question explicitly within a sort of developmental framework. And that means, of course, then we're working within this pedagogical sort of lens that we can begin to think more about, well, what does it mean to move through these stages? But at least it provides a certain kind of helpful sort of map in terms of thinking about this. And I'll come back to this too, because this ties in really closely with the narrative question, because some of these stages are particularly kind of most effectively communicated, or one of the most kind of central communication tools is story and narrative, and stories as meaning making devices and that sort of a thing. But the reason why I bring all this up at the outset is because I feel like it helps clarify this issue for me of the question of trustworthiness, because it frames it as the question of, well, who am I looking to for guidance? And if something like this does hold, then it would seem to me that basically I would be looking to someone who embodies and inhabits a kind of a perspective that we could locate in a sort of an adjacent stage, that I could say that has enough familiarity to me and enough similarity, but also is enough of a challenge, enough of a remove that I can see the gap that I would need to cross. And so this again kind of gets at that issue of the proximal zone of development, issues of flow and things like that. And I think that it's a calling of an adjacent group that, again, there's sort of enough overlap that I can see myself sort of prefigured in folks that are coming from this perspective, and that the question then of trustworthiness is sort of almost like trusting your future self, or who your future self would wish to become. And that would be sort of my way in to try to link these things. I think that these sorts of developmental typologies or taxonomies, again, can be certainly problematic. So I'd like to maybe talk about some of that, but just as a way into sort of the trustworthiness question and thinking about it in terms of when you have a map to be able to guide your transformation, and when you can be able to locate yourself kind of within a locus of enough similarity to what would be transformative in drawing you forward, then it sort of takes off the pressure of the sort of leap into the absolute, which isn't really possible necessarily from any particular given stage, but more of an incremental progression by means of inspiration. And when you have the maps that can help you do that, I feel like that can be really helpful. So I'm not sure if any of that lands, or if it's making sense, but yeah. So I just wanted to throw that out there, and then we can go anywhere with the rest of this and consider what the implications of some of this might be. So yeah.
Well, it's been a while since I read Fowler, so I might have some of the details wrong. But I don't know what this is, synchronicity or not. So I lectured yesterday on criticisms of Piaget's stage model of development. And of course, Piaget is behind Kohlberg, and Kohlberg is behind Fowler. There's a pretty direct line. And this ties right into the narrative. So we've got a narrative of development. And one of my criticisms about how people use Piaget, this isn't a criticism of Piaget per se, is they concentrate on the narrative of this stage, then this stage, then this stage, then this stage. The problem with that, and I won't go into the detail, is there's lots of empirical evidence that we don't have a monolithic mind that moves from stage to stage, that we don't leave previous forms of behavior behind, and so the narrative part of Piaget, and therefore of Kohlberg, and therefore of Fowler, the narrative of the stages is something that I'm always a little bit wary of. Now, what I proposed is that instead, what we should be concentrating on when we talk about development, this is about cognitive development, is we should be concentrating on the mechanisms of change as opposed to the narrative. And so here's an analogy. You've got a narrative of the fossil record, and here are the strata, and this strata is above this strata. You can do all that, but ultimately what I want Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. I want the mechanism of development rather than getting sort of caught up in the narrative of the stages or the strata, or however we want to put it. And the problem with this is, human development is a mixture of quantitative and qualitative, continuous and discontinuous. And the brain is not a single machine. It's a machine of machines that can make itself into different kinds of machines. And so I'm not saying we don't make use of the taxonomy, the stages, but you said you wanted to consider some of the problematic aspects. And one recommendation I would make is we hold the stages lightly because they only map lightly onto human development. And we don't let them blind us to, I think, the more important question. That's what I was doing with the fossil record versus Darwin's theory. The more important question is, what are the mechanisms of change? And then that I would then pose that taking a developmental approach to trustworthiness is, what is the evidence for the mechanisms of change in an individual? Let me give a concrete example of what I'm talking about. It's a pretty strong heuristic. I don't know if it's an algorithm, but it's a pretty strong heuristic that pain and distress tend to make people very egocentric and at times even selfish. And what that means developmentally is one of the mechanisms of change I would look for is the degree to which people have dealt with trauma. They've dealt with trauma in a way that is helpful to other people. because for me, that's an indication that they have loosened one of the great attractors to the black hole of egocentrism in a powerful way. And for me, some signs of that are a capacity to experience grief, share grief with other people. I think that's a very important ability, not to talk around it. Very often there's nothing to be said about grief other than sharing that you also have experienced grief, to open yourself up and share it with other people. And this goes with a broader, the degree to which people are capable of self-correction, not just being corrected by others, but of self-correction. Those, for me, they cluster together as an indication that people are doing things to overcome. I'll put it simply. It's more complex, but to overcome egocentrism, not to destroy it. By the way, that's not what I'm saying. But this multi-perspectival capacity. So that's what I mean by a mechanism of change. What is it? What are the processes and practices that people do that will actually put them through development, rather than trying to say which stage are they in? Like I said, I find that challenging and problematic. I'm open to discussion about this, though, Brendan, of course. But like I said, the prototypical instance of this is Piaget. And I think there's very good argument and evidence against, his monolithic mind moving through stages. But I do think his proposals for the kinds of mechanisms of change, assimilation, accommodation, stuff like that, I think those are well placed. And so similarly, I would like to look for what are the mechanisms of change that we're looking for in people, and what kind of evidence would we seek? And I gave some concrete suggestions. They were not meant to be exhaustive. They were just meant to be exemplary.
Stages are a very interesting thing to consider, and we do have to hold them lightly. And I think even the really good complex versions of them are imperfect and need a lot more work. But only the really good complex ones, I think, are worth considering. If you look at it through that Wilbur lens, you go, well, okay, maybe there's stages, but the stages might be moving along multiple trajectories simultaneously and in different styles for different modes and temperaments and typologies. And the stages are not replacements, they're additive inclusions. So the second stage transcends and includes and carries the first stage with it. So you start making a really sophisticated map, and then you wonder whether the sophistication you would need in order to make a stage model workable is worth it, when you could instead focus basically on the sets of procedures and supportive conditions that enable change from wherever you're at. But there's a balance there, because if you're climbing a ladder, so to speak, the most important thing you have to do is go to the next rung. And people who are engaged in long-term esoteric practice, I think, learn to get over their initial sense that it's a straight line from them to illumination. And they start to think about, well, what's my next step? However, in order to want to do it in the first place, you do need, like Brendan was saying, some kind of inspiration, some kind of prefiguring of what it could be like for you. I'm personally kind of curious about how Fowler relates to, what the metamodernists call cultural codes, right? Like, it's not necessarily a description in Fowler of basic stages of human development. It might be a approximation of stages of some kind of spiritual development or some form of human well-being, but then that would show up kind of orthogonally to different styles of receiving information and engaging in trust practices. And I think the big distinction there in terms of how people think about trust practices seems to be the people who are, to be a Piagetian for a second, more concrete operational and more formal operational. There's a lot of people whose reasoning is very symbolic, and they get trust markers when things match the symbol sets from their particular ecological cultural pool and lineage. And they might even prefer a flag pin to an actual war hero when it comes to patriotism, because trust is based on the symbol for them. On the other side, there's people like, I think of Leonard Cohen being asked what attracted him to Zen Buddhism, and he said nothing I met a human being I liked, and if he was an imam, I would be a Muslim right now. So for him, he was looking for some very specific functional characteristics in another human being, and it might even have been off-putting to him to have it be symbolically verified. There are a lot of people for whom it matches the symbol, or it's in the narrative, or it's in the text, or it's one of our things, that's a suspicious sign for them. So there's a sort of, modern or traditional, we don't have to think about it stages. It could just be two demographics, but I think there's two strong sets in the world of what people go to in order to look for trust markers in order to think something might be a source of wisdom.
Yeah, for me, what is helpful about thinking about it in a sort of progressive developmental sense is thinking about purely just demographics is sort of a relativization of that set, and it doesn't really propose any kind of connections of any particular nature other than just difference. Whereas if you can set these things in a particular sequence, you can begin to see certain kinds of attractor pulls and sort of magnetic movements going on between these different groups. And that's why, and this is also tied in with this issue of trust, is it's sort of like, who am I most likely to find trustworthy? Who am I most likely to see as my best future self as I can conceive of it from where I'm at now? Well, that's going to be someone who's a little bit further down that path than I am. So that's why I feel like this, if it could work, if it could be nuanced and complex in the ways that you're talking about, Layman, it would be helpful for being able to get a lay of that land. And also, it's crucial for me because of this issue of narrativization. It's like, one of the questions here about really the whole notion of the religion that's not a religion is there some kind of ideal version of it that everyone would be sort of relating with or engaging at a certain kind of form or level, or are, by the very nature of the fact that we're talking about this pedagogical pluralism, that this is being translated in different ways. And one of the ways that we're talking and discussing and problematizing is a narrativization sort of translation effect. And if you are thinking in a developmental or through a developmental lens, in Fowler, it's the synthetic conventional stage, which for folks who are engaging with matters of ultimate concern from that through that perspective, and using that set of kind of cognitive tools and whatnot, narrative is going to be crucial. And I think that if we're not sensitive to those needs of different people in a way that's not just saying, well, we could do without this if it were presented in the right way, or something like that, right? When we view it through this lens, it becomes actually indispensable for, and not for a negligible amount of people either. I mean, that's another kind of implication of the developmental lens, is you're seeing sort of the normal distribution fall in these particular stages of synthetic conventional and maybe some individual reflective. And that means that if we want to be efficacious and effective in our implementation of this communication, we need to take seriously where people are at, how they view the world, what tools they use to view the world and make sense of things, and then translate accordingly. And so that's why I feel like it could be helpful, but again, I think that there's also a lot that would need to be unpacked, and a lot of the dark side of all these issues is ever present for me, and I want to be really cognizant of all that. And having waded into now some communities that explore developmental frameworks of things, I've become aware of all sorts of ways that these things can be misapplied, oversimplified, and just outright abused if they're kind of not engaged with the sort of actual nuance and sensitivity that they require. So I don't know. That's sort of we can certainly very much continue the conversation without relying on a taxonomy that's kind of rooted in development. But I'd be also just curious to know to what degree we might find it to be a sort of loose construct to structure the conversation and the debate around these issues.
I think the point you made is an excellent one, the demographic versus the developmental. And I think it's almost inevitable that people will not sit with just demographics. They will try to organize them in some fashion. I agree. I think that's correct. And that is going to have some implicit normativity to it, which is going to make it a developmental model. The issue I have with so I think there's a sense in which if I think there's an argument I could maybe make on your behalf, go something like this. We take pedagogical pluralism to be a reality, and then we take it that what Layman says, there is the demographics, there's going to be the demographic differences, but then there's a third sort of premise, which is people are not going to leave these disorganized, uncoordinated. They're going to try and organize them in some fashion. That's going to either implicitly or explicitly put them into some developmental schema. I think that's a very good argument. And so we either leave it implicit or we make it explicit. I prefer making things explicit because that brings the possibility of transparency. But here's what I want to then say about that. And here's how I can sharpen my criticisms. The decision about the ordering of the stages is based on one of two things. It's based on an implicit normative model. Often the person proposing the sequence of the stages is the model of the culmination. That's clearly the case in Piaget. Everybody's trying to become a scientist, right? And so that's one. And I really am very wary of that. That seems to me to be one step away from cult formation, getting people focused on the individual rather than on development, etc. The other is there's often an implicit theory, and again, this is my point, of a mechanism of development. This is sort of the Aristotelian model. Here's the mechanism of development, and once you understand the mechanism, then you can justify how you place the stages in relationship to each other. So I'll take it that I'm like, there's this argument, okay, pedagogical pluralism, demographic differences, the inevitability of a developmental schema, and then, right, the normativities for justifying it. The two that I see most frequently used are, like I say, the normativity of a particular individual, and that's very problematic, or the Aristotelian strategy, ultimately Plato, but the Aristotelian strategy, no, here are the mechanisms of change, and given this account of the mechanisms, that's how I can justify the sequence. So I'm proposing that as a way of trying to gather together what we're saying here. I'm interested to hear what you two think about that.
I think the normativity problem is huge, or at least it's currently one of the major types of attacks leveled against developmental stage models in general, both for individuals and cultures.
Yes,
because everyone wants to be a scientist, but also everybody wants to be a modernity or something like that.
Yeah.
And I mean, you could say that everybody who's building a model is always looking back in a Hegelian sense and recapitulating the history that led to them, and that's fine. That we have to keep stepping back in a meta sense and make a model out of all the people doing that, because each one might be showing you their level and the preceding levels. So there's a way to mitigate that normativity problem a little bit. For me, one of the bigger problems is the possibility of multiple histories that aren't the ones that we inherit. Right. So even if we were to say that there's some kind of link between the skills that are privileged in modernity and some neo-Piagetian form of thinking, it's not necessarily the case that what we think of as modernity was the only way that could have gone. Right? A richer sense of human history goes, oh, wait, those skills were showing up in a lot of different ways in a lot of different cultures that we're looking at. And that's true of each of these. So if we wanted to think of stages, we would be thinking of sets of possible stages, most of which we're blind to. So that makes it a very, a more complex and organic and fun thing to think about, but also highly dubious to use as any kind of rigorous taxonomy or cartography. Informationally, right, and technologically, there's been some kind of drift over the course of history, and we could break that up into stages in terms of just the sheer complication of the cultural and technological environments and the types of pattern making that people are exposed to over time. And I think it's important to distinguish that in the sort of development and demographic sense from this other possibility of what we want of the religion that isn't a religion to do for people. That there's some kind of development that could be possible regardless of your cultural ethos. And it doesn't really matter whether we're thinking of that cultural ethos as part of a complexified unfolding historical set, or whether we think of it as just a random scatter of typologies. Nonetheless, any one of these ethoi can be a situation in which some refined gradation of human being is more possible. So I think one of the problems around trust is how do you build trust given the fact that people are in these different zones, and having established that trust, implement more of the developmental mechanisms of wisdom, given that there's a problem about being too simplistic and mechanical about how those dynamics operate.
And yeah, I think that's, you said the complication, but the complexification in some ways is really the mechanism, I think, which I think that's a really helpful way of parsing out what's helpful about the developmental model is in avoiding the pitfalls of sort of just thinking, well, here are these stages, let's fit people into them, but much more thinking, what process, what mechanism is unfolding that is generating what we are classifying as these stages. And so from that lens, I think the notion of nuance and refinement and complexification really is a crucial, at least a part of the mechanism. And when we can think about it that way, in the sense of, what the ecology of practices that you've articulated, John, and the sort of, awakening from the meaning crisis set of tools that is a reflection, a kind of metacognitive reflection on how the mind works, and then a kind of counter set of dynamical processes that can deal with these perennial problems, right? Comes from a certain skill set that allows thinking about cognition itself. And arguably, this is a big theme in so much of the developmental works, whether it's Keegan, especially Robert Keegan, but the notion of development is a process by which the subject becomes an object to itself successively in order to step back and gain perspective, which is a form of complexification and nuance, and is arguably what the set of tools are doing, is sort of saying, what is, why are we plagued by these various issues? Oh, well, the mind works in this way, and now we're aware of that, and now we can counter it. The question then is also, does one need to be at a sort of meta cognitive level to appreciate those things, or can that just the tools themselves be sort of expressed in sort of practical and pragmatic means that where that metacognition level isn't required? But the point is, I suppose I'm getting at here, is that the mechanism, which is also, again, to try this back into that level of trust, is I want to be more aware of myself. I'm a fish in water, and I want to be more aware of the water that I'm in. And each time I can do that, my world expands. I can take in new perspectives. I can be more aware of how I'm thinking and the various parasitic processes that are going on. I can name them. This is so much of the work that meditation does. And what all arguably, well, let's say this is an open question, but maybe this is the goal of these ecologies of practices, is to gain that sense of perspective. So if I'm seeing someone who has that richness of perspective, they're able to kind of look at things from a higher level, and I can sense that, but I'm still in the water, and so I want what they've got, and I trust someone who can speak with a greater level and a greater level of complexity, a greater level of self-awareness, and a greater level of someone with a greater optimal grip on reality, essentially. And that is going to be always kind of slightly out of reach if you think about it in a developmental process, and that is the attractor pull that's pulling people through. That's the mark of trustworthiness, is that sense, maybe even intuitive, that someone is at that next level, and that is attractive to me in every connotation of that term. It's attractive, and this again also ties in with the sense of beauty. So I'll throw some of those thoughts out there.
For me, what I'm seeing in that proposal, I hadn't seen it before, is you're basically proposing at the level of distributed cognition, the machinery of enhanced relevance realization. Basically, you've got people who do the compressive function, And then you have people who do the particularization function, and they're constantly flowing before. You get the variation and the selection and the variation. So you're proposing a system that is capable of evolving and self-correcting just intrinsically to its makeup. And I would put it to you that that would again be another criterion we would look for trustworthiness. So one is, a capacity to distinguish indispensability from metaphysical necessity and hold it with finesse, as you put it. But then rather than, you said, like an Iron Age hierarchy that is imposing, you've got a structure that is actually implementing in its structural functional organization the machinery of relevance realization, so that it is constantly in itself, it is exemplifying this constant attempt to fit itself to the world. At least that's what I'm seeing in what you're saying. And I find that very exciting.
Yeah.
I mean, one of my proposals has been, let's stop doing social organization based on hierarchies, and let's perhaps try and organize society the way the brain is organized, because the brain is the one thing we're pretty sure of can do relevance realization very well. So why don't we use that as a model? I'm hearing you say we can replace demographics and development with something that is in the Vedic model, which is levels of processing rather than stages, right? And that people, right? And so this is like the predictive processing model of the brain, right? At lower levels, the brain is basically predicting itself, and then very proximate stuff. And then as you move up, it's predicting very abstract stuff. But what every level is correcting the levels above and below it in a self-organizing manner. And so that allows the brain to have an optimal grip at any in a multi-perspectival way, multiple levels of interaction, multiple scopes, and I think if I'm taking what you said and putting it together with what I said and what about Layman, I think that's a really powerful proposal, because that to me is, again, organizing things more like the brain is organized. The temptation for that is it's superficially similar enough to Iron Age hierarchies that people could slide from what we're talking about back into Iron Age hierarchies. And so I think this proposal, at least I'm very excited about it. I'm going to stop talking so Layman can talk. But I guess I want to know how, like, part of trustworthiness would be, what are the marks that will allow us to clearly distinguish what I think we're moving towards proposing here from what it's superficially similar to?
Yeah, it's a really key question. And this mutually adaptive regulation at each of the levels has to be secured somehow.
Yes.
Obviously, we have some neurobiological processes that have done it. We've seen something similar happen in the emergence of the sciences in the last several hundred years. When Brendan's talking about the potential use of these developmental cartographies, they're very good, but they can't just trump the incoming experience, right? You're like, okay, I have a theory of levels. Now, what information do I have? How do I pattern the information, but allow the model to be repatterned by the incoming information as well?
Yep.
So we have to have then a lot of people who are skilled in that, and also have the ability to mutually verify each other as being skilled in that in order to help this succeed.
Yeah.
This reminds me a little bit of the problem we came to last time, the con and conveyor belt problem.
Yes.
Which is how do you tell those things apart? And for me, because I have some training in hypnotherapy, I think a lot about how people work with trance, right? That there's some people who it seems like they have a sophistication where you want to help them be free from trances that are being imposed upon them and more able to go into the trances that they want. There's other people who are going to have a difficult time gaining that skill set, and what they need is to have certain trances cultivated in themselves, and they know that they need. There's an adaptive process there. One of the methods of trance induction is what they call getting a yes set. So you get agreement from a person, so they're willing to go on this transformative journey with you. And one of the ways you do that is just to get them to affirm things that are already the case. Like, you've come to go into a trance today. Yes. You feel like you're willing to do that? Okay. Now, as you listen to the sound of my voice, can you hear the sound of my voice? Like, these are things that are already the case, and the person is now affirming them. And so the structure of the induction is matching what's already the case for the person. So the person can have trust because they can verify it because it's already the case for them. And because they're going into that affirmative mode of trusting, they are then willing to adapt themselves a little bit to the person who's trying to modify them. And it's only because the person who's trying to modify them has already adapted to their current condition. So I see something in there that's similar to the protocols that would be needed at all of these interfaces. And it leads to this other problem of how do we stop ourselves from constantly being hacked by things that resemble what we want, so that we can focus on hacking ourselves in the ways that we want to get hacked. And that's very slippery. So we need to look for signifiers that might be more primitive, that we think are no longer efficacious in getting the results that we want. Like we mentioned, the halo effect, right? A large number of the cognitive biases suggest to us that this is a trustworthy thing, that it's reinforcing something about ourselves so we can open and go along with the changes they're proposing. But there must be some indicators that suggest that that kind of trust is no longer viable for us, and we're looking for a higher grade of trust, which is a little bit like what Brendan is saying about the sponsor or the person who's helpfully just a little bit above us, right? How do we single that person out from someone who just wants to manipulate us or give us the feeling of trust, like a bank that has the word trust on it in big letters? Is that an indicator that they're trustworthy, or an indicator that they're untrustworthy?
Yeah, I think we want individuals who give us, and we'll have to talk about this more specifically, that they have a capacity to cut through bullshit in some fashion. And again, I want to come back to something I said before. They have a capacity to cut through bullshit when they're under stress, when they're close to being traumatized, when they're dealing with their own trauma, where they confront grief. It's fairly easy to talk about this stuff in situations in which people are sort of stable. But if we're going to be sort of honest to what the history shows is, people come into this, yes, they may have the carrot of aspiration, but they also have the stick of overcoming trauma and pain and foolishness and self-deceptive and self-destructive behavior. So again, one of the marks I look for is a kind of plausibility of evidence that this person can cut through bullshit even when their feet are in the fire, kind of thing. And for me, do I have lots of independent lines of evidence that they're capable of this? And then when I see them do it, does that open up paths of development for me that I didn't see before? That's what I look for. Like if it's like, in many different occasions, I saw Tom, be able to break out. He could have gone into like blah, but he broke out of it. He saw through the bullshit. And every time Tom has done this, it's opened up a path for me that I didn't foresee. That's the kind of thing you can see that in the traditions that people are looking for in individuals.
Yeah. It of course requires that people can recognize what cutting through the bullshit looks like, right?
Yeah.
And so this is, of course, this kind of paradoxical issue of sort of, you need to have that capacity, and yet that is also the skill set that's in some ways supposed to be taught by the person that you are finding trustworthy. So, yeah. Which opens up the possibility that there's a plurality of different skill capacities for being able to do that cutting through the bullshit is itself a kind of unfolds through a spectrum, so that certain things, sort of more obvious things can be immediately sort of, oh yeah, I get that sense. But then as you maybe are guided along and are you progress through this developmental process, or this learning, this cultivation, you can sort of cut through more and more refined layers of bullshit, potentially. Do you think that is a fair way of saying that?
Yeah, I think putting it together, what we're looking for are individuals. We want that it's plausible that they are complexifying on a specific kind of optimal grip, which is the ability to cut through bullshit. And to do it in a wide, like I said, plausible, wide variety of situations, wide variety of pathways. Yeah. I it's like, this is a notion that Paul van der Klee makes use of. I think at the initial levels, I mean, like in predictive processing, all you're doing is the brain is just trying to predict its own sensory motor patterns, right? I think at the very basic levels, we're looking for a kind of dead reckoning rather than here's the grand vision of where you're going to end up, right? And Jordan Peterson talks about this, and the Bible. Don't talk to people about the gospel if they need a coat, right? That kind of idea, which is right? We look for individuals at least at a basic level who are capable of helping people do the dead reckoning of moving away from self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior, moving towards just more meaning in life. I'm more connected to myself, to other people, to reality. And we're very sort of, I would propose, very metaphysically agnostic, the way Layman talks about. Are you just getting the dead reckoning going? And then if that person can help me can help others, initial dead reckoning, then they sort of earn, I don't know what to call it, the right or the privilege to start, foreseeing where the dead reckoning might be going, something like that. They speak out of the dead reckoning rather than having a pre-established utopia towards which they are drawing people.
That's
what I'm.
And for me, that means that the trustworthiness is always incremental, or I shouldn't say always, but if we think about it in an incremental fashion as being, I'm here and there's maybe, this is where I used to be, and here's where this person is, in front of me that I'm trusting, that I'm learning from, as it were. Then you get this sort of unfolding series of kind of partially overlapping layers, in the sense that who I find trustworthy today, I don't think I would have been looking to them 10 years ago, right? So I've been able to go through that process. There's something about this. What I wanted to make this point about this was, we were talking also about institutions as regulators of integration, and the problem of over homogeneity and sort of too much difference and diversity. But if we think about it there, that's the sweet spot, really, is that you're in communities of people who are both calling you forward and whom you are able to, from your vantage point, assist in that process. So that's why you go to church. That's why you find the importance of that diversity, not solely because it'll open you up to different perspectives and that sort of a thing, but it's part of the pedagogical process in itself. And the image I almost have in my mind is that kind of Dionysian hierarchy of the celestial orders, and that he has a whole notion, drawn from Plotinus and all that, of sort of the archangels. They'll tend to the stratum below them, the angels or what have you, and each layer above is sort of leading up the previous layer, and that is sort of a task that is itself, I think, a practice that I think is part of religious practice. It's sort of, it's a built-in pedagogical practice. It's not like the elite is just leading everyone somewhere. It's that the whole community is leading itself. And to be able, if there is something that the elites are doing, is they're able to get a broader sense of that whole picture of incremental change, and then getting the broader perspective of, well, where is this leading, and what can we say about the bigger picture, which is something that you can't see when you're more in the process.
I mean, that's really cool. I mean, because so what like in the brain, what happens is the higher levels try to predict the patterns that are going to show up in the lower levels, and then if they're wrong, they don't. What they do is they try to change their model, right, so that they can better predict, right, and then they pass that down to the next level. And so then it just recursively all the way down until at the bottom level you're just doing the level above is predicting what, right, the patterns of dead reckoning for the lowest level. Like here's a sensory motor pattern, and it's right, and if we go that way, we're going to do the dead reckoning as the internal distress is going to go down somewhat, kind of thing. So and maybe that's, again, there's a commit. I mean, Stanovich says, what the hallmark of rationality is ability to commit to the process rather than being fixated on the product, right? And this is why I'm using the dead reckoning model. If everybody is, and this is, I think, part of the Vedic formulation that Layman's proposing, if everybody's committed to a process, right? A share, right? It's like the Darwinian process is shared, but the Darwinian products can vary as long as everybody is committed to this overall process. I mean, that's what we used to think when we believed in democracy, that people were committed to the processes, and that we all committed to. And what's happened is what we did is we gave priority to procedural justice over substantial justice, because we figured this would be how we dead reckon towards that. Now we've inverted it, which is, I think this is another conversation, very dangerous for us as a society. But I do think that it would be something I would look for too, is that like are all the levels, that the level is only leading to the degree to which it is self-correcting in its modeling of the level below us. That's the level below it. Sorry, not us, right? There has to be like embedded a shared ethos of, right, of this deep integration of self-correction from below, and prediction and leadership from above. I'm proposing that we model our processing on the best processors that we know about, rather than what we've done before. What we've done before is we sort of, here's where we want to be, and then we model the processing in terms of that. And I'm proposing an alternative way in which we model the processing. We look at some of the best processors that are available, the brain, and various social configurations, like when democratic societies are functioning, and we try to figure out what's the modus operandi of this? What are the principles by which these things operate in this intelligent, adaptive, self-correcting fashion, and then try to model the processing on that. That's another thing I just wanted to explicate as an alternative strategy than the strategies we've been using in the past, which is we get a vision of where we want to be, and then we plan for that, and then we organize according to the plan. And I'm proposing something very different to that.
Yeah,
I think we're all reasonably on the same page about that part, John, where if there's what we might call a telos, it's a mutually adaptive telos that continues to change. It's how well we're doing the process in the moment. It's not a fixed goal set. Now, you could say it is, in fact, a fixed goal set in the sense that we're trying to get back to that optimal thing, but we're trying to get back to that adaptively in each moment rather than setting some static form of it from the past.
That's good. I think we could be helped then, if we're in agreement. I'll take another step. I think we could be helped again by taking very careful look at, how living things work, and how cognition works, and how viable systems, how distributed cognition have worked, and then try to use that again as just saying we're going to try and make the best recursively self-correcting process that will dead reckon us, right, in the way that these things are adaptive. It will take us away, hopefully reliably away from suffering, both the distress and loss of agency, and towards enhanced connectedness with ourselves, with each other, and the world. And that to me is a very I don't want to be too strong, but it's a good alternative to the utopic planning way in which we have tried to do this in the past. And therefore, I'm looking for a significant difference from how we've done it in the past, so that we have rational hope that we can overcome some of the mistakes of the past.
And how we've done it in the past is a fluctuating terrain. So it would be really interesting, in my mind, the way I think about it is you would take an analysis of how these complex, adaptive, multi-layered process systems operate well, And then
Yeah.
you would also look at how we've tried to instantiate religions or wisdom-like projects socially over time and see where it looks like they were doing better and where it looks like they were doing worse. And is there some kind of matchup, right? Are the systems
Yeah.
approximating
Excellent.
these processors over time? And then we would have a
Excellent.
really interesting data set from that.
Yes. I think that's a brilliant proposal. Exactly. And you could do, you'd have the model, right, from the functionality, the mechanism, and then you'd have the data, and you'd get a reflective equilibrium between them as the best account possible right now. I think that's an excellent and brilliant proposal, Layman.
And it seems like, both of you would be in a great position to be doing that sort of work. John, with your understanding of cognition and how these processes work, and Layman with your understanding of religious practices and history. And it'd be, it'd be fascinating to try to map those two onto each other in a way that could be useful.
I think it's more than useful. I think it's imperative. I really think this is a very good proposal of how to start generating specific content to help us start to specifically organize communities and communities of communities. I think it's a very important project that we should somehow consider about how to make it start happening.
I maybe propose that this is where we pick up next time then, and maybe see if we can deepen this idea, or
well, let's take it a little bit further. But I mean, there's a lot of research and reflection that needs to be done, but we could at least maybe start the ball rolling next time. I'm very excited about what Layman just said. Thank you, Layman. I think that's an excellent project proposal.
Yeah, that would be, I think, an excellent place to pick up next time, and with all of us having a little bit of pondering on it between now and then. I think this question about democracy and how those processes might enact a sacred civic space in nations is also a very interesting question. And I think Brendan might be interested in bringing in the forms of myth a little bit more, because I think that's an important piece of this we haven't really delved into. So we're going to join again soon on the Integral Stage podcast.
Yes, look forward to meeting both of you there.
Thank you both so much. This has been a pleasure and an honor to have such minds to converse with, and I deeply appreciate the conversation and where this is all going. And so until next time on Layman's channel, take care, everyone.
Take care.